Mated to the Lycan King, Part 5. Raven woke at dawn to the gentle stirring of the life growing within her. Warm, golden sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the royal chambers, illuminating her pale skin and the mark on her neck. As she pushed herself upright, she felt an odd mixture of anticipation and anxiety fluttering in her chest. The kingdom was at peace, at least for now, and yet her instincts refused to let her fully relax. Carrying a pup, as Lucian affectionately called their unborn child, changed everything. She could no longer throw herself into danger without caution, and the kingdom itself seemed to watch her with renewed reverence, as though each step she took was doubly precious. She slid out of bed, pressing a hand over the subtle swell of her belly, and silently marveled at this new chapter in her life. Just a few months ago, she'd have never believed she would become queen of the Lycan Kingdom, let alone expect a child. Lucian was still asleep, sprawled across the pillows in a rare moment of repose. Raven took a moment to study him, appreciating how even in slumber, his protective aura seemed to envelop her. His golden eyes were closed now, his features softened, but the firmness of his jaw and the faint scars visible across his broad shoulders reminded her of the battles they had fought side by side. A soft knock at the door ended her reverie. She quickly slipped on a robe, cracking the door open to find Darius waiting, his expression a blend of urgency and concern. She stepped into the corridor, closing the door gently behind her so as not to disturb Lucian. "Your Majesty," Darius said, bowing. "I wouldn't normally disturb you at this hour, but there's a matter that requires your attention." Raven frowned. "You know I don't stand on formalities with you, Darius. What's happened?" "There's been an incident on the northern border," he said, keeping his voice low. "It may be nothing, a rogue sighting perhaps, but the patrols are uneasy. Given everything we've faced, they want reassurance." She took a measured breath. "I see. I'll need to consult with Lucian. Thank you for bringing this to me." Darius nodded and departed, leaving Raven to return to the chambers where Lucian was stirring. She found him sitting on the edge of the bed, raking a hand through his dark hair. He looked up at her, his golden eyes instantly honing in on her face. "Everything all right?" he asked, concern lacing his voice. She explained what Darius had told her, and Lucian's expression hardened with the protective vigilance that had become second nature. "We'll look into it," he said, rising and pressing a comforting kiss to Raven's forehead. "I want you to stay safe, though, no unnecessary risks." Normally, Raven would have argued she was more than capable of handling herself, but the unborn pup changed her approach. She found herself nodding, albeit reluctantly. "I'll be cautious," she assured him, "but I refuse to be coddled." Lucian's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Wouldn't dream of it." They dressed quickly. Raven chose a gown that accentuated her growing belly without sacrificing freedom of movement. She had a kingdom to oversee, after all, and a developing life to protect. Lucian fastened a short cape across her shoulders before they left for the Great Hall, where the council would soon gather to discuss any threats along the borders. Word spread quickly that their queen was on the move, and by the time Raven and Lucian arrived, the council members were already waiting. Kieran stood off to the side, talking quietly with Ella. Ella's posture was more relaxed these days, her expression more open whenever Kieran was near. Her red hair gleamed under the torchlight, and she glanced up with a gentle smile, one Kieran returned with a look of profound affection. Raven felt a flicker of happiness for them both. The meeting commenced with Darius outlining the reports from the northern border. Thalos, standing tall with his arms crossed, listened intently. His sharp eyes didn't miss a single piece of information. Occasionally, his gaze would flick to Raven, concern evident in the slight narrowing of his eyes. "It's not a direct threat as far as we can tell," Darius concluded. "But the scouts said there might be organized movement just beyond our boundaries, like someone, or something, is probing for weaknesses." Lucian exhaled slowly. "We can't ignore it. If there's a force gathering, We need to know who's behind it. Raven stepped forward, placing a hand on the table. We've just come out of a difficult war. The kingdom is still healing. Our resources are stretched, and so are our people's nerves. We must be swift and decisive. Thalos cleared his throat. I've spent time consulting old records. There's rumor of a clan that once served under Gregor, but they vanished before the final battle. If they've resurfaced, their goal might be to destabilize the new peace. Raven's gaze flicked to Kieran, who appeared thoughtful. She could almost sense his mind racing through different possibilities. He caught her eye and gave a slight nod. They were twins, after all, and though they often needed words to communicate strategy, a shared glance could sometimes suffice. The deepening of their elemental powers had drawn them closer, too, so that Raven could feel a subtle stir whenever his wind-based magic shifted in response to his emotions. Then we investigate, Lucian said firmly. Kieran, I want you and Ella to quietly scout the area with Darius. Keep your numbers small. Don't engage unless absolutely necessary. Kieran exchanged a look with Ella, who responded with a resolute nod. Even though she was still adjusting to her role as Kieran's mate, she had never been one to shy away from a fight, especially if it meant protecting those she cared about. After the meeting, Raven made her way to the training grounds with Lucian, determined to observe the warriors' drills despite her condition. A few heads turned in concern as she approached, but she greeted the warriors with a reassuring smile. She refused to vanish into the background simply because she was pregnant, though she took care not to overextend herself. She and Lucian watched from a safe vantage point as swords clashed and wolves sparred under the early morning sun. Amid the clang of steel, Thalos approached them. "Your Majesty," he said to Raven, inclining his head. Then to Lucian, "There's something I've been meaning to discuss. I think we should look into the archives for any references to splinter groups or exiles. If a hidden enemy is indeed gathering, there must be a record of them somewhere." Lucian exchanged a glance with Raven before nodding. "Agreed. We can't leave any stone unturned." Raven saw the worry in Thalos's eyes, and she caught the subtle shift in Lucian's stance. Both men were deeply protective of her, but she couldn't deny that they were right. "Let's go now," she offered. "We'll check the archives ourselves." Lucian gently placed a hand on her arm. "I'll go. You should rest." Raven arched an eyebrow. "I can read old tomes without endangering the pup, Lucian." A soft chuckle escaped him. "I know better than to argue with you. Let's do it." They spent the next few hours in the dusty lower chambers of the castle, where ancient scrolls and volumes filled endless shelves. Raven's heightened sense of smell, common among Lycans, was not exactly helpful in this environment, where dust motes danced in the beams of torchlight and the scent of old parchment was overwhelming. Despite the discomfort, she pressed on, determined to find any clue that might reveal this new threat. Thalos joined them, scanning the shelves for references to Gregor's allies. They found mention of minor houses, loyal to Gregor in times past, but nothing that pointed conclusively to a hidden enemy. At one point, Raven paused on a passage describing an ancient tradition of rogue alliances that once threatened the stability of Lycan rule. The language was cryptic, talking about a shadowed pack, rumored to be loyal to no king, abiding by a code of secrecy. She read it aloud, and Lucian leaned in, brow furrowing. "Could this be them?" Raven asked, lowering the parchment. "It might be," Thalos replied, his voice subdued. "They could still be out there waiting for a chance to strike." Lucian took the parchment from Raven's hands, studying it. "We'll cross-reference this with the rest of the records, see if there are any more mentions. If they're stirring now, they've chosen a precarious moment, just when we're rebuilding." The sound of footsteps on stone made them all turn. Darius stood at the entrance, dusting cobwebs from his sleeve. "Kieran and Ella are preparing to depart for the northern border," he informed them. "They'd like to see you before they go." Raven nodded, following Lucian and Thalos out of the archives. Her mind buzzed with possibilities. The mere thought of another war made her stomach churn, partly from the pregnancy, and partly from genuine dread. She had seen enough bloodshed and feared for the safety of her unborn child. Still, Still, she steeled herself. She was a queen, after all, and she would not let her people suffer if there was any way she could stop it. They emerged into the courtyard where Kieran stood beside a pair of saddled horses. Ella, dressed in leathers that allowed for swift movement, checked the reins and saddle straps. She looked up, face lighting up briefly at the sight of Raven and Lucian. "We'll be back soon," Kieran promised, "and just need to investigate who, or what, is lurking out there." Ella's voice was steady. "I've never been one for quiet reconnaissance, but I'll do my best to lie low. If there's trouble, we'll handle it." Raven embraced her twin, feeling the familiar surge of elemental energy that always seemed to linger around them. "Be careful. And remember, if things look worse than expected, return immediately." Kieran nodded, his expression serious. "Understood. We're not looking to start a war. Just gather information." Lucian stepped forward, clasping Kieran's shoulder. "We're counting on you. Keep your focus, and trust your instincts." Shortly thereafter, Kieran and Ella mounted up and rode off into the early afternoon sun, Darius right behind them. Raven watched them disappear down the winding road, a familiar ache blooming in her chest. She wanted to be alongside them, fighting and protecting the kingdom. Her own wolf stirred in agreement, but the life within her reminded her that her responsibilities had shifted. She had to think of her child now. Lucian slipped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. "We'll hold down the fort. Let them handle this." She nodded, pressing closer to him, though her mind whirred with worry. She could sense Lucian's own tension, the unspoken worry that always came whenever loved ones left on a dangerous mission. For the remainder of the day, Raven tried to occupy herself by overseeing tasks within the palace, hearing petitions from villagers, ensuring that trade routes remained stable, and verifying the well-being of the orphanage. Yet a sliver of anxiety persisted, a quiet fear that the peace they had fought so hard to achieve was standing on a fragile foundation. Late in the evening, Thalos brought her the news she dreaded hearing. Kieran's party had encountered something near the border and had sent a messenger back. The details were sparse, but they indicated that Kieran and Ella had stumbled upon evidence of a camp, a substantial one, and had decided to investigate further. Raven thanked Thalos, her heart pounding, and made her way to Lucian's study. She found him poring over maps, lines of concentration etched into his features. When she relayed the message, he inhaled sharply. They should have waited for reinforcements. This could be a trap. Raven rested a hand on his shoulder. Kieran's not reckless, he'll be cautious. Ella and Darius are with him. He nodded, though tension hummed beneath his skin. I know. Still, I can't shake the feeling something is off. In the hours that followed, neither of them could rest. They moved about the palace in a restless vigil, each trying to reassure the other that all would be well. When dawn broke, a scout arrived, breathless and shaken. He relayed that the group had been ambushed but had managed to break free. Kieran and Ella were trying to fend off repeated attacks from unknown assailants. They needed backup. Lucian's wolf bristled at the news. Raven felt the surge of power in him, and although her pregnancy made her reluctant to fight, she refused to leave her twin to face danger alone. Within minutes, they had assembled a small strike force. Thalos armed himself with 2 blades, and a fierce determination burned in his gaze. Raven and Lucian shifted into their wolf forms, an action Raven found more exhausting than usual, and led the pack out of the castle gates. The journey north was swift yet tense. Every mile seemed to stretch with unspoken fear. Raven could feel her heart drumming in her chest, her heightened senses picking up every crack of twig and rustle of leaves. Eventually they reached a clearing where the scent of blood and the sounds of a skirmish hung in the air. Lucian let out a guttural growl, and the pack surged forward into the fray. Kieran and Ella were backed against a cluster of rocks, fighting off a group of wolves wearing unfamiliar insignia. Darius, shifting between his human and wolf forms, darted in and out of combat with lethal precision. Raven wasted no time, calling on the fiery energy within. Even pregnant, she could harness her power. Flames licked at her hands as she launched herself at the attackers, forcing them to scatter. The enemy wolves snarled, momentarily taken aback by the sudden reinforcements. Lucian charged in, jaws snapping, flanking Raven with deadly efficiency. Thalos focused on clearing a path to Kieran and Ella, using his dual blades to create a perimeter of protection. It was chaos, each clash echoing with savage intensity. The sharp tang of blood filled the air, but Raven pushed through, determined to reach her brother. Finally, she saw Kieran deliver a powerful gust of wind that sent 3 wolves tumbling backward. Ella, fighting at his side, delivered precise strikes, her every movement fueled by fierce loyalty. Raven joined them, unleashing bursts of flame that forced the remaining attackers into retreat. As the dust settled, the enemy wolves regrouped on the opposite side of the clearing, snarling with frustration. Their leader, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a cruel glint in his eyes, spat on the ground. "The kingdom can't hide its weaknesses forever," he growled. Then, with a sharp motion of his hand, he commanded his wolves to retreat into the dense forest. Within seconds, they vanished, leaving behind only the echoes of their threat. Kieran, panting and bloodied, turned to Raven, relief flooding his features. "Thanks for the rescue," he managed between breaths. Ella looked equally shaken but held herself upright, her eyes reflecting both fear and fierce determination. Darius, arms scratched and bruised, stumbled over, wiping sweat from his brow. "They came out of nowhere," he said, voice ragged. "Organized. Like they'd been planning this." Lucian shifted back into his human form, catching his breath. He surveyed the scene with sharp eyes. "We need to find out who they are and what they want," he said, voice low. "They're not simple rogues." Raven felt a tremor of exhaustion course through her, and Lucian's hand was at her elbow in an instant, steadying her. She forced a reassuring smile, though her heart was still hammering. "Let's get everyone home safely," she murmured. They returned to the kingdom in a somber procession. The injuries varied among the group, and though no one was mortally wounded, the attack shook them all. Back at the palace, healers attended to cuts and bruises while Kieran, Ella, and Darius recounted the ambush in more detail. The unknown wolves had seemed to know exactly where they were, as if someone had guided them to that spot. Suspicion began to swirl among the royal guard, and the notion of betrayal from within their own ranks grew increasingly plausible. Thalos paced the corridor outside the infirmary, his mind clearly racing with possibilities. Raven watched him, her own nerves raw, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Let's not jump to conclusions," she said softly, "but we can't dismiss the possibility either." His jaw set in grim acceptance. "I'll investigate. Someone must have tipped them off." In the following days, the tension within the kingdom mounted. Thalos and Lucian discreetly questioned members of the pack, searching for any sign of divided loyalties. Raven tried to continue her duties, meeting with villagers and ensuring that no panic spread. Still, word of the ambush traveled quickly, and whispers of a looming threat stirred unease. Meanwhile, Ella and Kieran grew closer, bound by the trial they had just survived. Late one evening, Raven passed by the palace gardens and spotted them sitting together on a stone bench, Kieran's arm draped protectively around Ella's shoulders. Their voices were too soft to hear, but the affection between them was unmistakable. Raven felt a pang of gratitude. In such uncertain times, at least love could still grow. Yet not all love came without conflict. One afternoon, Raven found Lucian staring out from the balcony overlooking the training grounds. She sensed his turmoil, approached him silently, and rested a hand on his arm. "I hate feeling powerless," he admitted, voice low. "We've faced threats before, but this one slips through our fingers. We can't fight an enemy we don't understand." Raven leaned against him. "We'll figure it out together. The kingdom is strong, and so are we." He turned to her, the golden glow of his eyes reflecting both worry and devotion. I won't let anything happen to you or our child." Their conversation was cut short by a knock on the balcony door. Darius stood there looking grave. "I found something," he said. "You'll want to see this." They followed him down to the lower levels of the palace where a makeshift interrogation room had been set up. Inside, Thalos guarded a trembling wolf whose torn clothing and ragged breathing suggested he'd been captured after a recent scouting skirmish. Raven's pulse quickened. This wolf might hold the key to identifying the hidden enemy. Under Thalos's firm yet controlled questioning, the captive wolf revealed fragments of information. A group calling themselves the Shadow Claws had been gathering forces at the kingdom's outskirts, following the command of a powerful leader who despised the new monarchy. They had alliances with certain factions who remained loyal to Gregor's ideals, though the captive's knowledge stopped short of knowing names or precise locations. Raven exchanged a look with Lucian. The sense of betrayal gnawed at her. Gregor was gone, yet his legacy of hatred lingered, fueling an undercurrent of rebellion. As they stepped out of the interrogation room, Thalos's expression was grim. "We'll need to act fast," he said. "If these Shadow Claws are building an army in secret, it won't be long before they strike again." Lucian's posture straightened with resolve. "Then we make the first move. We won't wait for them to bring war to our doorstep." Despite her condition, Raven refused to sit idle when the kingdom's future was at stake. As the day of confrontation approached, she, Lucian, and their closest allies formulated a plan to draw the Shadow Claws out into the open. They rallied their finest warriors, ensuring that the pregnant queen would remain at a safer vantage point, ready to unleash her powers if necessary, but not recklessly endanger herself or her unborn child. The night sky glimmered with stars as the pack prepared to face this new threat. Kieran and Ella stood hand in hand, their bond stronger than ever. Thalos and Darius took positions at the head of the formation, their loyalty unwavering. Raven and Lucian led the strategy, weaving their combined authority and raw power into a formidable presence that demanded respect. The ambush was set at a remote meadow where intelligence suggested the Shadow Claws gathered. Positioned under cover of darkness, the royal forces waited for hours. Tension coiled in the air, taut and stifling. Then, just before midnight, movement rustled through the tall grass. Dark figures slipped from the shadows, their eyes reflecting a feral gleam. A chill wind swept across the meadow, and Raven's heart pounded. This was it. Lucian stepped forward, voice resonating with command. "Surrender now, and you may find mercy," he declared. "Continue this treason, and you'll meet the same end as Gregor." A mocking laugh answered. "You can't snuff out the old ways that easily, King," came a voice from the darkness. "Your queen will fall, and with her, this kingdom's false peace." Dozens of wolves erupted from the night, howling and charging. Lucian let out a battle cry, shifting seamlessly into his wolf form, while Raven called on her elemental magic. Flames danced along her arms, lighting the field in a surreal glow. Kieran and Ella darted forward, combining wind and lethal skill to drive back the first wave. Darius roared, shifting in a burst of power, tearing through the Shadow Claws with savage precision. Thalos moved like a specter, blades flashing under the moonlight as he cut down any foe that dared approach. Amid the chaos, Raven spotted a towering figure directing the Shadow Claws, a hulking wolf whose eyes burned with hatred. He roared commands that spurred his followers onward, a dark presence that radiated pure malice. She realized this was the leader. Summoning courage, she sent a torrent of flame his way, forcing him back. He howled in pain but rallied, turning his fury on her. Lucian intercepted him with a bone-shaking clash of teeth and claws, the ground quivering beneath their struggle. Raven's vision blurred as she fought off another attacker, mindful not to overextend. Suddenly, a wave of wind from Kieran sent the hulking wolf staggering, opening him up to a vicious strike from Lucian. The enemy let out a final gurgled snarl before crumpling to the ground. Leaderless, the remaining Shadow Claws lost formation, Some broke ranks and fled, while others, cornered, dropped their weapons. Darius, breathing hard, shouted for surrender. Thalos secured the captives, ensuring none slipped away. The night air buzzed with the aftermath of violence, low growls, ragged breathing, and the thick scent of blood. When dawn finally broke, the meadow was strewn with the remnants of a hard-fought battle, but the kingdom's forces stood victorious. Raven let her flames dissipate, cradling her belly as she exhaled in relief. The baby had shifted within her during the fight, a reminder of the life she fought to protect. Lucian, returning to his human form, approached her with concern, etched across his face. "Are you hurt?" he asked, scanning her for injuries. She shook her head, leaning into him. "I'm fine, just tired." Kieran and Ella came over, both bloodied but alive. Ella's eyes glistened with both triumph and lingering fear. "It's over?" she asked shakily. Kieran nodded, wrapping an arm around her. "For now." Darius and Thalos organized the capture of the remaining Shadow Claws, ensuring they would face justice. One by one, the captured wolves were bound and taken back to the kingdom. Though some had escaped into the wilderness, the immediate threat was quelled, giving the Lycans another precious window of peace. In the following days, the captives were interrogated, and the infiltration from within the kingdom came to light. A minor official in the palace had been feeding information to the Shadow Claws, hoping to restore Gregor's legacy. Lucian dealt with him swiftly, stripping him of rank and exiling him for high treason. The resolution brought both sorrow and relief. Sorrow that betrayal had lingered within their walls, and relief that the hidden threat was finally addressed. As time passed, the kingdom regained its equilibrium. The people once again looked to Raven and Lucian with renewed trust, grateful for a leadership that would stop at nothing to keep them safe. Kieran and Ella continued to grow closer, forging a bond that weathered every trial. Darius and Thalos remained at their posts, ever watchful, ever ready. One moonlit evening, Raven and Lucian stood on a high balcony overlooking the kingdom, arm in arm. Her pregnancy was more pronounced now, and Lucian placed a gentle hand on her belly. "We've come a long way," he murmured, gaze drifting across the spires and homes below. Raven nodded, recalling all the battles, betrayals, and precious victories that had shaped them. "And we still have so far to go," she said softly, "but we'll face it together, no matter what comes." A flicker of wind rustled Raven's hair, and for a moment she sensed Kieran's presence somewhere in the castle, a comforting reminder of their shared elemental powers. Night creatures called in the distance, and the moon spilled silver light across the balcony. Raven leaned in against Lucian's, locking her lips, her heart full of hope and resolve. She might have been a rogue once, scorned and adrift, but now she was queen, respected, cherished, and bound by a love that transcended fate. With her mate by her side and her child on the way, she felt an unbreakable certainty that whatever new trials lay on the horizon, they would face them united. Nothing could stand against the will of a kingdom that had fought so fiercely for its peace, and nothing could dim the flame of a love that continued to burn brighter with every challenge.